It was billed as the deal of the century. Now it may be remembered as the steal of the century.
Welcome to WatchMojo, and today we'll be counting down our picks for the top 10 most expensive mistakes in history.
This, I gotta say.
For this list, we're looking at some of the costliest, most infamous errors in history. Let us know which you think was the most embarrassing in the comments. Number 10. Heavy submarines. Maybe they are designed to reach astonishing depths, but that's no good if your submarine is incapable of surfacing again. That's exactly what happened to the doomed Isaac Perel class of Spanish submarine, when designers realized that somebody at some point had carelessly left a decimal point in the wrong place. The sub was 100 tons heavier than it should be, meaning that if submerged, it would never be able to return to the surface. Thankfully, the sub hadn't yet been built, so the schematics were changed to make it longer and capable of supporting all of that extra weight. Except there was another problem. The sub was now too large to fit into the port where it was being constructed. Number 9. New Coke. In 1985, about a century after Coca-Cola first hit shelves, Coke decided to mix things up and rework the tried and tested Coke formula.
Yeah, Coke is it. Come on, check it out now. It's got a new taste. It's a definite wow.
The result was New Coke, one of the biggest marketing fails and disasters of all time. The simple fact was that nobody really liked New Coke. Coke wanted to make its drink taste more like Pepsi, which is a little sweeter than Coke, and it was a resounding failure.
All the taste tests said people preferred the taste of this new product to the century-old product. What they hadn't factored in was the huge emotional attachment there was to this brand.
Though we understood trying to corner Pepsi's share of the market, consumer capitalism is about choice. Nobody wants to choose from two identical colas.
It's a Coke. Coke is it.
There was just no reason for Coke to try and destroy its own business by changing the recipe. Number 8. Ronald Wayne sells out.
You know that when people hear your story, they say to themselves, my gosh, $22 billion, he could have had it.
What can I say?
Hindsight is 20/20, which is why this error stings so much. Back in '76, businessman Ronald Wayne met Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and initially thought they had something with their fledgling computer company. Wayne went in with a 10% stake in Apple, but it wasn't to last. Less than 2 weeks on, he'd lost faith, selling those shares back to the company's founders.
If I had stayed with Apple, I probably would have wound up the richest man in the cemetery.
As we all know, Apple went on to become one of the biggest companies and electronic manufacturers in the world, with over 1 billion active iPhones as of 2021. What we wouldn't give for a time machine to the 70s so that we could invest in the Apple shares that Ron Wayne gave up.
I knew exactly what would have been if I had stayed with the company. I would have wound up heading a very large documentation department at the back of the building, shuffling papers for the next 20 years of my life, and that was not the future that I saw for myself.
Number 7. Wrong trains. We've seen submarines too big for their ports, but what about trains too wide for their platforms? That's what happened in France in 2014, when France's national rail company, SNCF, put in an order for 2,000 brand new trains. The trains would fit in many big metropolitan stations like Paris's newer infrastructure, but in rural France, the platforms were too narrow. This all happened because somebody at the French rail network gave SNCF the wrong measurements.
The reason that they've got this problem is because RFF, which is the rail network operator, had measured platforms and stations that were built about 30 years ago, and the access between the platforms looked about right.
SNCF was left trying to secretly widen the affected stations, but eventually the error was made public. The trains themselves cost around $20 billion, and modifying the platforms has cost over $60 million.
Investors are indignant about the mistake. We refuse to pay a single cent for these repairs, said this spokesperson. We can't be taken for fools and pay for the privilege.
Number 6. Quaker buys Snapple. In the early 90s, Snapple was only on the up. It had a few high-profile ad campaigns that meant it was able to hold its own in the competitive world of juice and soft drinks, making it look like a promising investment opportunity for Quaker Oats.
Quaker Oats doesn't come with prizes. but there's something in this box that I think is really worth prizing.
Unfortunately, things didn't go to plan. Though Quaker Oats spent $1.7 billion on a deal it thought was a sure thing, after only 3 years, Snapple was sold off again, so that Quaker Oats could lick its wounds for a meager $300 million.
Here's some iced tea to pass the time, but remember, nothing takes the place of a good education.
Perhaps a little embarrassingly, Snapple is still going strong. It seems that separating was the best thing for both of these brands.
Snapple, made from the best stuff on earth.
Number 5. Star Wars Billions. In the mid-1970s, nobody knew that Star Wars was going to become one of the biggest pop culture properties in history.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Production was expensive and difficult and ran George Lucas into the ground. Not seeing its potential, 20th Century Fox made a deal with Lucas that he'd receive the royalties from merchandise sales. What followed set a new standard for merchandisable franchises, giving Lucas a personal fortune to the tune of billions of dollars. It was a grave error on the part of Fox and saw the studio miss out on an absolutely obscene amount of money in the decades between Star Wars release in the theaters and Lucasfilms being acquired by Disney.
You have lost.
No. 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 You must die.
Number 4. Russia sells Alaska.
It's quite cold up there. Let's not be over-enthusiastic about it.
It's easy to look at a map of North America and wonder why Alaska, isolated as it is on Canada's western coast and completely separate from the U.S. mainland, is one of the United States. But it's been that way since the 1860s, when the territory, then controlled by the Russian Empire, was sold by Tsar Alexander II to America for the low price of $7.2 million.
He found a buyer in U.S. Secretary of State William Seward, who agreed to purchase it sight unseen. On October 18, 1867, here in Sitka, Alaska was officially transferred to the United States.
Today, that's over $130 million, which is still a paltry sum when you consider how large and valuable Alaska is, what with its many oil fields.
You can ask the thousands of roustabouts, roughnecks, and oil workers why they come to this frozen patch far above the Arctic Circle to make a living. But the answer is simple and one word: money.
The reason the territory was sold was to recoup losses from the Crimean War, and because Russia doubted it would be able to defend Alaska from invasion anyway. Number 3. AOL buys Time Warner.
What you will come to know, as we know instinctively, that there is a natural fit between these two companies.
In the year 2000, the dot-com bubble was at its height, and it didn't look like anything would slow down the meteoric rise of the internet.
Well, pretty clearly, if you looked at last Friday, the market cap of AOL was twice the size of Time Warner. I've made a judgment, which I believe to be correct, that going forward, the Time Warner shareholders will be much better off owning 45% of AOL Time Warner than 100% of Time Warner.
Ultimately, the internet's development didn't slow down, but the stock market did, leading to a recession. One of the biggest casualties was the merger of AOL and Time Warner in 2000, which even at the time was viewed by many as being a ridiculous idea.
But things didn't turn out as planned. From the very beginning, the merged company failed to live up to its lofty financial expectations. To make matters worse, technology stocks that had been thriving in the 90s suddenly fell off a cliff with the burst of the internet bubble.
AOL spent a whopping $182 billion on merging with Time Warner, but years on, the companies split again. Today, Time Warner remains a major player in the media business, and while AOL still exists, it's dead in the water. How the tables turned.
Is that the biggest regret of your life?
What?
Having all your money tied up in Time Warner.
No, I would have liked to see that merger not happen.
Number 2, Apollo 13.
Houston, we have a problem.
The basis of a blockbuster movie starring Tom Hanks, Apollo 13 was destined for the moon in 1970, but it never made it.
It was plagued by bad omens and bad luck from the very beginning.
Thankfully, unlike many other space failures, like the high-profile Challenger and Columbia disasters in 1986 and 2003, respectively, the astronauts in Apollo 13 all survived. The problem was that an oxygen tank had been damaged long before its installation in the spacecraft, which was described as a bomb by Commander Jim Lovell.
I looked at my companions and I said, you know, every flight has a crisis. Something always goes wrong. This happened early in the flight, and we're now free and clear of any other things going wrong.
That bomb went off, severely damaging the craft when it was already in space. The crew had to move into the lunar module so they would survive, and then loop around the moon to return to Earth. Before we unveil our top pick, here are a few dishonorable mentions. Morgan Stanley's losses. Broker Howie Hubler lost billions of dollars speculating on mortgages in the 2000s. Lost Bitcoin. James Howell accidentally threw out a hard drive with $480 million in Bitcoin on it.
You know, you've never thrown a hard drive out before. Why start now? You shouldn't do this, sort of thing. You know, a little demon in the back of my head, sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I didn't take it out. It stayed in the bin.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications.
Number 1. Chernobyl.
The chain of disaster is now complete.
In 1986, the biggest nuclear disaster on record was triggered. The Soviet Union was initially extremely secretive about what had happened, with many downplaying the severity of the meltdown even when nuclear fallout spread as far west as Germany.
Are we now to assume you do not have the situation under control?
Oh, no, we do. I do. Radiation is within normal limits.
But eventually the truth came out, and it was revealed that a slew of errors was to blame for Chernobyl, making it an entirely avoidable tragedy. It was the human error of the unprepared shift workers, combined with a fatal design flaw that was known about but not fixed. The problem was that the control rods, made of boron, had graphite tips, and the graphite reacted with the core to cause the explosion.
The boron rods were in fact tipped with graphite, and that short moment when they are first inserted into the reactor, the graphite in fact leads to a surge in the power, not a reduction of power.
Without the cheap graphite, the disaster wouldn't have happened.
Do you agree with our picks? Check out this other recent clip from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.